Listen, the Stars by John Brunner. Originally published in the July 1962 issue of Analog magazine, it next appeared as an omnibus with a Lee Brackett novella in a Spanish-language book released in Brazil and Argentina in 1963, followed by another omnibus the same year, this time alongside a novella by Jane Roberts so terrible I can't even name it. It showed up in an Italian magazine, also in 1963, followed by a German chapbook in 1965, and a Serbian magazine in 1988. Most significantly, the author considerably extended and updated the story to novel length in 1972 and called it The Star Droppers. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Listen, the stars. 1. Star Dropper? Said the dark, uniformed customs officer. He could have meant Dan himself or the instrument slung over his shoulder. Either way, the answer was yes. Dan nodded. So am I, the customs officer said. Just taking it up. Aha. Dan looked interested. What model do you have? This is a hand-assembled job. A guy makes them in L.A. I wish I could spare time to look at it, the customs officer said with real envy. Powerful, is it? One of the best. From outside came the choking roar of a Mach 3 Express taking off under rockets. The customs officer slashed quick chalked crosses on Dan's 3 bags. "Hope you enjoy your stay in Britain, sir," he said, and moved on. Dan kept his long-jawed face impassive, but behind it his mind was very busy. It was one thing to be told that the star-dropping craze had a tighter hold here than at home. It was another to run up against proof within minutes of his arrival. One more minute, one more proof. Standing by the door, labeled Transit Lounge and Exchange Facilities, was a wild-eyed young man, hair untidy, shirt filthy at the cuffs, one cheek smeared with grime. As the newly arrived passengers filed past him, he was saying fiercely to each of them, "Clutch remove! Listen to me, will you? Clutch remove!" The passengers scowled and tried to avoid him. Nearby, Dan saw a policeman and a member of the airport staff watching the young man with serious faces, but they did not interfere. The instant the young man saw Dan's star dropper, he seized Dan by his lapels and thrust his face close. "You!" he barked. "Clutch remove! What does that mean to you?" "Nothing," Dan said shortly. "Take your hands off me." "It must! Listen again. Clutch!" Dan tugged the clawing hands free of his jacket and shot a glare at the policeman, who came forward at last. "Mr. Gray," he said sharply, "if you're going to be a nuisance, I shall have to turn you out. Understand?" A tear squeezed out of Gray's left eye and mingled with the grime on his cheek. Hopelessly, he turned away from Dan. "What does he have to do to be classed as a nuisance?" Dan demanded of the policeman. "Well, he's expecting someone he says he heard of through his star dropper, sir. You can hardly blame him, can you?" "But there's a time and a place for everything." The policeman shrugged. "He's no great trouble, sir. And the slightest chance, you know, always worth taking." Dan was not clear what the remark meant, but he did not want to make himself conspicuous by saying so. He shrugged and crossed the lounge to an exchange counter. While waiting his turn to be served, he had plenty more reminders of the grip the star-dropper craze had here. There were many vivid posters advertising instruments or kits of parts, and on one of the padded benches nearby, a girl sat with the earpiece of a star-dropper half hidden in her bright, fair hair. Building up a charge like the man Gray? Dan hoped not. She looked too pretty to go mad. As his taxi spun down the Great West Road towards London, Dan opened his own instrument and stared at it for the 20th time. What were these things all about anyway? About half the contents of the shallow square box made sense: the earpiece on its cord, the transistorized amplifier, the power source too. You could run a star dropper off flashlight cells, house current, solar batteries, but this, as he told the customs officer, was an expensive handmade model and used a fuel cell and a little tank of butane gas. So far, so good. What could be made of the rest? An Alnico magnet on a brass slide, toothed to engage with a worm. A calibrated plastic knob on the same shaft as the worm, with a ratchet to hold it on a chosen setting. An ultra-hard vacuum in a little aluminum box. There was a getter in the box to keep the vacuum swept, but about once a month you had to trade it for a fresh one. The butane tank, a standard cigarette lighter refill, was guaranteed for a year and might last 3 times as long. Add it up, and you got nonsense. But Dan put in the earpiece and twisted the plastic knob at random. A susurrus of noise began, like waves on a distant beach. He closed his eyes to concentrate. True enough, the sound was attractive. It hinted at meaning, like a voice speaking a foreign language, or more nearly like music, able to conjure up ideas without communicating them. But after a while, the sound broke up in a gabble of shrill squawks, and he took out the earpiece and shut the case. Maybe he just wasn't getting the point. Plenty of his friends had taken up star dropping and talked him into trying their instruments, but what they found fascinating he'd found, at best, interesting. He'd taken the instruments for toys. Now he knew they were more like loaded pistols, because at the end of the line might be a man like Gray, shouting crazy nonsense at strangers. Asking what a star dropper really did seemed futile. Dan reflected that he'd had the benefit of an explanation from Berghaus himself, the only man with a theory to fit the facts, and even that had brought him no further ahead. Moreover, for a scientist, Berghaus had been driven to some appallingly unscientific terms. Psychic continuum, for example. It seemed that this was simply an unscientific sort of phenomenon. Here were signals being generated without reasonable cause from the juxtaposition of a hard vacuum, a magnet, and a power source. Signals that were not random noise, but at least as highly organized and hence information full as human speech. Information, as Berghaus had stressed, was not meaning. It was a technical term related to degree of ordering. When the phenomenon was still a lab curiosity called the Rainshaw effect, people naturally assumed the ordered nature of the signals was related to periodicity of atomic or molecular vibration in the matter composing the equipment. It was Berghaus, after months of investigation, who found the extraordinary statistical resemblance between the signals and the output of living nervous systems. The evidence was too technical for Dan to follow, but Berghaus summed it up this way. Just as, for instance, the Zeeman effect tells an astronomer that a magnetic field surrounds a star, so these signals have characteristics suggesting they originate in an organized, percipient nervous system. About a year earlier, Berghaus had proposed his now famous theory of precognition. There was so much objective evidence that one was badly needed. To account for transfer of information future to past, he invoked a space equivalent for it to travel through. Non-Einsteinian in that instantaneity there acquired a definite meaning, and permitting knowledge of an event at moment X to become available at moment XY. Reluctantly, Berghaus said, "It seems to me that these devices may tap the space equivalent, which I have called the psychic continuum, just as the mind of a man with ETP does." What Berghaus said might be newsworthy. Reporters inquired why, if these signals originated in living minds, they should not be translated into words. Berghaus answered honestly that all living, aware beings, human and otherwise, might have access to this timeless channel of information. Human and otherwise? The reporters pressed him. You mean creatures on other planets, under other stars? Why not? Shrugged Berghaus. If they exist, and they very probably do. To him, it was merely a possibility which could not be ruled out, but the reporters went away and coined the phrase, eavesdropping on the stars. Someone put out a cheap portable version of the puzzling device, purely as a gimmick. Someone else nicknamed it a star dropper, and the world seemed suddenly to go insane. 2. At 2:50, Dan was almost alone in the lounge of his hotel, dawdling over an after-lunch coffee, and therefore it was already a warning when the burly man took the other chair beside the low table where he was sitting. Dan studied him. He was big-boned, going bald, with a bristly brown mustache and red cheeks, and he smiled to see Dan's eyes on him. "Special Agent Cross?" he said politely. So someone had goofed, but there was no point in arguing. "Just plain Mister," Dan said after a pause. "The organization has a title. We don't." The burly man flipped an ID card from his pocket. It had his photo pasted on it, and underneath was written, Hugo Samuel Redverse, Chief Inspector. Dan sighed and gave it back. "What can I do for you?" he said. "Oh, answer some questions," Redverse said. He ordered black coffee and a cigar from a passing waiter and leaned back. "In particular, what brings you here? Our man at the airport was puzzled to see a special agency operative with one of those gadgets on his shoulder." He indicated Dan's star dropper lying on the table between them. "Cross isn't your real name, I take it?" he added. Dan shrugged. His real name was so far in the past, it felt like just another of the dozen aliases he had had to use. "Well, I won't press you," Redverse said. "I worry about what people do, not what name they choose to do it under. Well?" The waiter brought his coffee and cigar, and he passed the cigar under his nose appreciatively before lighting it. It was galling to have to declare any agency interest to an outsider, but there it was. Fortunately, there was no special secrecy attached to this trip, only what was necessary to preserve his future usefulness. He said reluctantly, "Star droppers." Redverse nodded. "I thought so. I was wondering when you'd get into the act. Everyone else has been in it for months. Just fact-finding?" "That's about the size of it." "You're very welcome, then. By the way, I can save you some trouble. Your room isn't bugged. I had it checked. I knew which it was because one of my men made your reservation for you. All in all, I'm rather pleased with myself today, which is why I'm treating myself to this cigar. I imagine Havanas are something of a forgotten luxury as far as you're concerned. For a guy who knows all the answers, you're trying very hard to needle me," Dan said. "I suppose I am. Sorry, I'll get to the point. People are interested in star droppers for various reasons. Commercial rivalry, for example. The things were invented here and became highly profitable almost overnight. Then we get troubled with addicts who are convinced someone has found out how to turn the signals into plain English and is hiding things from them. Rubbish, of course. And there's this idiotic rivalry between the great powers to secure from star droppers some mystic knowledge that will make them masters of the world. The special agency is the most fanatically internationalist of the UN organizations, so unless you've turned your coat, we can rule that out, which means that you're looking for someone you don't expect to find. Right, Mr. Cross?" "You do know all the answers," Dan said at length. "I apologize." I wish we did, Redvers said heavily. One of the policemen at the airport said you were taken aback by Gray. I can assure you that even if he was acting, he's fairly typical. Acting? The guy yelling nonsense at the passengers? Oh, yes, he's one of my best men. We've been living by our wits in this country for the past decade, Mr. Cross. We've got pretty good at it. Professional admiration was getting the better of Dan's dismay. He said, "Maybe I shouldn't have troubled to fly over. I could just have called you up and asked you. No, we're too close to the problem to make sense of it. What I'd like most is advice from one of these alien creatures people claim to hear by star-dropping. Failing that, the view of an outsider like yourself. First visit? Yes. But you'll have been thoroughly briefed. I know your people. And like them, I might say. We appreciate your insistence on being on everybody's side instead of one side or the other. Of course, that's how we regard ourselves nowadays, and we know it isn't easy, since we opted out of the arms race and adopted our neutralist policy. Both the great powers have been treating us like a sort of overgrown Tangier, a strategic zone where everybody and his uncle seems to be plotting a coup d'etat. This elderly continent of Europe is the battleground of the late 20th century, and we're right in the firing line. Not that anyone would know, just looking. It's deeper than you can see. It's in the mind. But of course we're certain of one thing. If the world ever does blow up, both sides are going to hit this island on the principle of denying ground to the enemy. That's where independence gets you. Oh, life isn't dull here, but it's a strain. In fact, the psychologists say that's why we took so avidly to star-dropping. People are desperate for security, and they'll grab even so slim a chance as the hope of knowledge from the stars. I've heard that theory. Is it sound? Perhaps. On the other hand, the country where star-dropping is most widespread after Britain is India. It appeals to the religious and mystical sense of the people there. You can take your pick of explanations. There are plenty to go around. He gulped down his cup of coffee all at one go. I gather the craze in the States is about 6 months behind ours, he went on after a pause. About that. It has a hold on the West Coast, as one might expect, but we have nothing like your student problem yet. Yes. Unfortunately, it's mainly sensitive, intelligent young people that star-dropping appeals to. Students, as you say. Some get addicted as though to a drug. Some go insane. But what's worst, of course, is that people do disappear. Redvers spoke so casually, Dan could not prevent a start of surprise. Yes, Mr. Cross, Redvers affirmed. From your reaction, I deduce that's what brought you here. We've documented 20 cases where we can't shake the witnesses. Usually they vanish with a noise like a door slamming. I hope you've only heard rumors, because up to now we've prevented any reputable news agency from picking up the stories. It's been difficult. What sort of rumors? Dan said. That these people had discovered mystic alien abilities through star-dropping and gone to put them to use. That matches up, Dan nodded. And you? Are you convinced? No, not yet. But I have a suspicion I will be eventually. And if this is true, it's explosive. A power of instantaneous displacement, if it can be controlled, could be used as a weapon. Even if it weren't, it might frighten someone in a position of power so badly he might lose his head. And that, of course, is where you come in and why I'm glad you're here. Dan nodded. The agency had one sole purpose: to identify threats to the peace of the world and ruthlessly cancel them out. There had been 2 sensational political assassinations, for instance, not long before. Social psychologists had plotted graphs and said, "Such a man is not sane, and a lunatic in his position could start a war." So, how would you like the opportunity of meeting the man who started all the trouble? Redvers suggested after a moment. You mean Rainshaw? I guess I wouldn't object. Fine, I'll arrange it, and I'll keep in touch during your visit. Maybe I can give you help towards a solution. He got to his feet and held out his hand. Feeling slightly numb, Dan shook with him and watched him stride away towards the exit. I was never so politely told I was incompetent. Gradually, he began to relax. There was a man you could respect for being clever without suspecting him for being cunning. That trap at the airport, for instance, with the man Gray. Brilliant. Dan had never considered how closely Gray could study his face, hear his voice, and even feel his clothes while howling his nonsense. And Redvers did know all the answers. It was exactly the rumors that Stardropper enthusiasts were vanishing which had brought Dan across the Atlantic. Redvers had just informed him that they were more than rumors, and he was clearly worried. Which implied that even if they had opted out of the arms race, these people, by turning Stardroppers loose on the world, had lit the fuse on a sizable bomb. Dan shook his head and picked up the gaudy covered magazine on which his Stardropper was lying. He had spent the flight from New York reading a pile of such magazines. The Stardropper craze had set a record for the speed with which it had produced hobby magazines and clubs of enthusiasts. This one was called Star News and was published in California. What interested Dan about it was not the chatty news of personalities, nor the reviews of new equipment, nor the letters from enthusiasts recommending their favorite settings on various instruments, nor the turgid and semi-mystical articles forming the meat of the issue. What had struck him was a full-page advertisement inserted by an Oxford Street, London store. If it advertised like that in a magazine from Los Angeles, it would be a good place to begin his inquiries. 3. Behind curved, non-reflecting glass, a 6-foot star turned slowly in midair above a dozen recent model Stardroppers displayed on red velvet. In place of a door, there was an air curtain. Dan stepped through. Her feet hushing on deep-piled carpet, an attractive girl in black came up to ask what she could do for him. Dan lifted his Stardropper. "I think my vacuum's gone soft," he lied. "Do you keep trade-in tanks for this model?" The girl looked the instrument over and nodded. "Oh, yes, if you'll come to the counter, I'll get you one." "Thank you." He followed her slowly, looking around. This was certainly a profitable business. The whole store had a rich look. Even the shelves at the rear were covered in red velvet like that in the window. 4 other customers were present. A man and a woman of middle age sat side by side in the corner farthest from the door, listening to portable Stardroppers. Neither moved visibly while Dan was in the store, and at the counter 2 young Chinese were asking technical questions of an equally youthful clerk. Dan knew that a great many Chinese tourists were visiting Britain nowadays, but according to his briefing, star-dropping was considered antisocial and time-wasting in Eastern countries, so it was surprising to find them here. The girl came back with a fresh tank of vacuum. "Shall I fit it for you?" she asked. "Well, thanks very much." She attended to the job deftly. "We haven't seen you before, have we?" she said conversationally. "You're American?" "That's right. I saw your spread in Star News and figured I should call in. Say, how can I get to meet some people working in the field while I'm in London? I'm new to this." The girl shut the case. "That's 30 shillings, please," she said. Well, we can certainly help you there. We run a club for our regular customers who want to do research, and our manager, Mr. Watson, is the chairman. You should talk to him. I'd very much like to, Dan said. I'll ask if he can see you right away. Perhaps you'd care to glance through our catalog while you're waiting? She put a fat, loose-leaf binder in front of him. He hefted it, surprised at the size of it. How many different models do you stock, for heaven's sake? He demanded. Around 60, but there are 100 or more in production. Impressed, Dan carried the catalog over to a chair by the wall and opened it. There was a blurb on the first page. We live in a strange era. Until recently, death was our closest neighbor. We walked with him day and night. He has not gone from us, but since the discovery of the star dropper, we have learned that life is as close as death. Some people seek in the sounds of a star dropper new knowledge of the universe and of man. Others ask no more than the comfort of experiencing for themselves the signals which, scientists tell us, indicate that other beings in the universe live and think, and perhaps love. Whichever class you fall into, we are at your service. Cosmica Limited. Well, that was one way of looking at it. Behind him, a voice said, "One of Harry Benton's hand-built jobs." Dan turned. The speaker was a man of 40-odd, smart in maroon and black. "Mr. Watson?" he said, getting to his feet. "That's right." Sit down. That is one of Harry's instruments, isn't it, Mr. Cross? Dan Cross. You're quite right. Do you know them? Oh, yes, we're agents for Harry in this country. Very fine work he does, too. There's no more powerful model you can carry on a strap. Have you tried many other instruments? As a matter of fact, no. I got hooked by a friend just recently, and he recommended me to get a Benton. Watson cocked his head on one side. A little too powerful for a novice, possibly. Let me just try you with a Gale and Welchman. It's one of the cheapest we stock, but there's a setting on it which can be a revelation. He fetched a large plain instrument in a white case and set it on his knee. Passing the earpiece to Dan, he said, "Tell me when I get the setting right, will you? It does vary from one instrument to another, of course. Getting anything?" Obediently, Dan closed his eyes to concentrate. Somewhere at the back of his mind, a drum was beating. A slow rhythm built up from it, quickened, grew louder. A melodic instrument joined in, or was it a voice singing? No, it was more like a joyful shout. The drum beat was changing to a tramp of feet. Changing, or had he mistaken it at the start? Yet it wasn't marching feet at all. It was the pumping of a large heart, and signified life, awareness, vigor, even violence, for it was the rumble of an earthquake at work on the building of mountains, and the shouting was the scream of rocks being ground upwards past their ancient bedfellows. It stopped, and he opened his eyes. He was shaking all over. "Well?" Watson said, grinning like a Cheshire cat. "You're right. It's amazing." Dan wiped his sweating palms. "That's what star dropping is all about, you realize?" Watson patted the instrument he held. "This model has an excellent repertoire. I've known people who've gone on to big fixed home installations and haven't been able to part with their original Gale and Welchman. They liked it so much." A reference spotted in a magazine crossed Dan's mind. "You can't get that on any other instrument, then?" he suggested. "Oh, no. Why, even Gale and Welchman turn out the occasional failure, which lacks the setting I just demonstrated. But I wouldn't sell one here. It would be deceiving the customer." He turned to put the instrument aside. Our club does a lot of work trying to match up signals received on different instruments and establish a proper system of calibration, by the way. I gather you were inquiring about it." "That's right. There's obviously a lot for me to learn, and I want to meet some people doing real work in the field." Watson took a card from his pocket. "You're welcome to join us," he said. "We meet every Wednesday, as you'll see, and of course it's Wednesday tomorrow." The card said, "Club Cosmica," and gave an address in the center of London. Dan pocketed it, getting to his feet. "Thanks very much," he said. "What time should I arrive?" "About 8. We have a demonstration this week, so it'll pay to be prompt." Outside the store, Dan almost fell over a girl sitting on the sidewalk. She had the earpiece of a star dropper in, and her eyes were closed. She was chalking a series of spiral lines on the ground. Presumably, she hoped that someone would recognize the meaning of the pattern and speak to her, but no one did. In a drugstore window shortly afterwards, he saw single earplugs on sale, labeled, "To aid concentration while star dropping." Waiting to cross the street at a stoplight, he heard one teenager hail another. "Dropped any good stars lately?" And then a man of 60 or more went by, pushing an old hand cart. On the cart was a huge, shiny star dropper. From the speaker oozed a sound like something flat and clumsy being moved about in thick mud, sucking and plopping. Following the cart were 5 or 6 youths and girls. One of the girls had a look on her face like a saint in ecstasy, and her boyfriend had to lead her by the hand. But next to her was another girl who was clearly getting nothing from the sound and kept shooting envious glances at the luckier ones. She had short-cut black hair and a peaked gamine face with a sullen mouth, and she wore the leisure clothes currently popular with both sexes, a high-collared shirt and check pants. What attracted Dan's attention to her he did not know, but what attracted her attention to him was obvious: his star dropper. She fell out from among her companions as though giving up in despair, and came up to the sidewalk where Dan was standing, fumbling in a pocket. She moved very swiftly as she went by. When her hand came out of her pocket, it held a knife. The knife slashed the strap of Dan's star dropper. She caught the instrument as it fell, tugged it loose, and took to her heels. 4. Half a dozen people saw her do it and tried to stop her, but if she had picked on almost anybody else except a special agency operative, she probably would have got away. As it was, Dan didn't catch up with her until he'd followed her across 2 dense lines of traffic, dodging cars like a doubling hare, and reached the edge of Hyde Park. There it was simply a matter of wearing her down, and as soon as she saw he was still on her track, she gave up all hope of escape. He expected her to distract him by throwing the star dropper down and making off without it, but she just stopped, clearly exhausted even by such a short chase. Wondering at the defiance in her dark eyes, he came up to her. She looked undernourished, a strange sight in this prosperous city. He studied her, but said nothing. As though reading his mind, she said, "I wouldn't have thrown it away. It might have got broken." Dan still said nothing, but went on looking at her. A few seconds of that, and her self-control broke. She thrust the star dropper violently towards him. "Here you are," she said shrilly. "Go on, take it." He did not move. Not understanding, she bit down on her lip. A crafty look crossed her face. You aren't going to turn me in?" she suggested. "No, I don't think so," Dan said. The girl brightened visibly. "Would you let me try it?" she ventured. "That's the only thing I wanted it for, I swear. I didn't mean to sell it or anything, and—" She seemed to be screwing up her courage. "If you want anything, I'll do whatever you want if you'll let me try your dropper. Is that what you were going to say?" Dan moved his right arm like a striking snake and twitched the strap out of her grip. He brought the instrument up short on the end, an inch before it hit the ground, watching her. It looked from her expression of alarm, followed by relief, as though she was telling the truth. So here was one of the young addicts Redvers had mentioned, and whom he had learned about in his briefing. "You louse," she said with a pathetic attempt at dignity. "Did you pull wings off flies when you were a kid, too?" Dan began to knot the strap together. He said, "What's the problem? Don't you have a star dropper of your own?" "I did have. My mother said I spent too much time with it, and she broke it, so I walked out. But I can't afford a new one, and it's sheer hell being without because I was getting somewhere. I know I was." "Haven't you friends who would lend you theirs?" "Oh, I've tried that. None of them were right for me. I saw that yours wasn't any of the kinds I've tried, and I wanted to use it for a little. Maybe none of them will work except the kind I had before, but it's torture not to be certain. Look." She held one thin hand before her, and it shook like a wind-tossed leaf. "What did you have?" "A Gale and Welchman, just a cheap one, but very good." So this was the result of using Watson's pet model. How on earth had things been allowed to get so bad? "What is it about star dropping that gets you this way?" Dan demanded. "How can I tell if you don't know? You're a fan yourself." "I could live without it. Apparently you couldn't." She made a helpless gesture. "Suppose you had a dream," she said thinly, "and you saw something important, a vision of the future maybe, and you woke up and remembered you'd seen it, but not what it was. And it's so important that if you don't see it again, you might as well cut your throat." Dan hesitated. "Have you eaten today?" he said finally. "I don't remember. I don't think so. Nor yesterday." Wondering if he was doing right, Dan said, "I'll make a deal with you. There's a stall over there. You eat something, I'll loan you my instrument for a while, and you answer my questions while you're eating. Fair?" "If you're trying to make me ashamed of stealing your dropper, you've won your point," she said. "I think I'd better go and find my friends and quit bothering you." He sighed and took her by the arm. She didn't resist. Even while eating, she never took her eyes off the star dropper. She seemed scared that it might vanish. She ate the sandwiches he gave her with voracious speed, but not from hunger, from eagerness to get the tiresome job of eating out of the way. "What's your name?" he said. "Lilith Miles." "What do you do?" "Nothing." "Literally?" "I was at school. I had this bargain with my mother that I'd keep up with my schoolwork if she let me go on star dropping. Not that it seemed important compared with what you learned from a dropper, but then she went back on her word and smashed it one time when I was out. So I left. I told you." "What have you learned from your star dropper?" "It doesn't go into words. It makes sense on its own, and no other way. Sometimes you get a little scrap that's quite clear, like a friend of mine had news his father would die in an accident. But that sort of thing isn't important. Some people go out of their minds, don't they?" "Oh, plenty." The thought seemed not to disturb her, which Dan found more shocking than anything else so far. "They get impatient, I guess. One girl I know, she started fixing nonsense names on things and went around telling them to people, thinking they'd understand. Of course, they never did." "Doesn't that upset you at all?" "No, it's like death. Happens to other people." In its way, of course, that was an acute remark. He said, "And how about the ones who disappear? You know about them?" A note of envy crept into her voice. "They're the ones," she said. "They've got it and gone." "You know where they go?" "If I knew, I'd be there." She looked at him, puzzled. "How come you don't know all this? Are you playing games?" "No, I'm asking questions to hear your personal answers. Has anyone you know disappeared? Any of your friends?" She shook her head. "How do you know about such people, then?" "Oh, everybody knows about them. You don't talk about it much. It's, well, scary. Follow? But that's the big thing. And nobody knows what really happens to them? You can't know till it happens to you. Sometimes you almost get it, then it's gone again. It's like trying to catch a wriggling fish with bare hands. You miss 100 times, but you have to keep trying. You have to be so hungry for fish you daren't get impatient. Can I try your dropper now?" She threw her paper coffee cup and sandwich wraps into a litter bin and reached for the instrument. Reluctantly, Dan let it go. "This is a beaut," she said, impressed. "I never used a fuel cell model before. How do you step up the power?" He showed her the little sliding switch on the cell. She tucked the earpiece into position and closed her eyes. The taut, nervous lines beside her mouth faded. She began to smile a little. Watching, Dan felt an obscure sense of guilt, and yet it was pleasant to see the change come over her face. She moved the adjuster knob with such patient care that at first he did not notice when she stopped moving it. Then he began to wonder how long he should let her continue, what she would say if he interrupted her, and even, the ridiculous thought crept eerily into his mind, whether she would here and now find what she was looking for and vanish. He shivered. It was growing cool as evening approached, but that wasn't why he shivered. He lit a cigarette and compelled himself to be as patient as she. Almost half an hour had passed when she opened her eyes, looking vaguely disappointed. "Didn't it work for you?" Dan said, rather relieved. "Oh, it was great," she contradicted. "It's much more powerful than mine was, so it's hard to sort out what matters. I just can't concentrate anymore now. But can I try it again?" Dan hesitated. It would be valuable to be able to question this girl who claimed to know what star-dropping was all about. But then, "I promise I won't pester you. I won't be a nuisance." She might have been reading his mind. He threw up his hands and nodded, and she pried his name and the address of his hotel out of him. Then she walked off across the grass. After a little, she began to skip on every other step from pure joy. Out of curiosity, Dan put the earpiece in. The instrument was still on the setting that had given her so much pleasure. He listened. No, it was no good. It sounded like a dozen banshees having a party, a pattern of shrill acid whistling. He had already chanced to cross this setting and disliked it. She'd had a Gale and Welchman. As Watson had proved to him, that model had attractive qualities, but how could this unpleasant noise relate to what he'd heard in the Cosmica store? How could it possibly become meaningful? He had learned a lot, there was no denying. It was of a piece with the whole curious muddle that the more he learned, the more confused he became. He got up and began to walk slowly away. 5. He was shaving next morning when Redverse phoned. "Good morning, Cross," the chief inspector said. "I've arranged that meeting with Dr. Rainshaw as I promised." "Morning, Redverse. I don't want to seem ungrateful, but is all this purely for the sake of being cooperative?" "Partly, and partly because I need an outsider's view of things, as I told you. Tell me, did Watson talk you into going to the Club Cosmica tonight?" "Is that store bugged by any chance?" "No. Watson simply talks everyone he can into joining his club. It's perfectly genuine, by the way, not a racket." "You're very interested in Watson, aren't you? Why?" For the same reason you are, of course. The biggest store of its kind in the country is a good place to keep in touch with what's going on. Look, I won't keep you from breakfast. Rainshaw is at a government research establishment in Richmond, on the fringe of London. I'll pick you up at 10, okay? Promptly at 10, Redvers arrived, driving himself in a small electric blue convertible. Dan was waiting in the hotel foyer and came out to the sidewalk. Immediately, the car stopped. He was making to get in when he heard his name called shrilly, and there was the girl Lilith hurrying towards him with a look of bitter disappointment on her face. "Just a moment," he told Redvers under his breath. He turned to greet the girl with a smile. "I'm very sorry," he said. "I have to go and see someone right now. Suppose you come around this afternoon instead?" "Oh!" Lilith turned the corners of her mouth down in annoyance. "You did say I could, you know." "I do know, but this is important business." "What's the trouble?" Redvers called from the car. In a few words, Dan explained about his promise to the girl. While he was talking, she turned away, looking so woebegone it was almost funny. He began to unsling his star-dropper, thinking he might loan it to her for the morning, but Redvers guessed what was in his mind and shook his head. "Not if you want to see it again," he said. "You're probably right," Dan agreed reluctantly and glanced back at her. Her face had suddenly brightened again. "Can't you let me sit in the back of the car?" she said. "I'll be dead quiet, I swear, and then you'll know I can't run away with your dropper." Dan laughed and looked at Redvers, but Redvers was not amused. He said, "It's up to you, Cross. I don't care, provided I don't hear one squeak out of the instrument." Dan shrugged and let Lilith get in. Delighted, she curled up in a corner and held out her hand for the star-dropper. Reflecting that this was no crazier than anything else which had happened, he gave it to her and got in the car himself. "You won't know I'm here. I'll be so quiet," Lilith said. "I hope that's true," Redvers said grimly and engaged forward drive. Dan glanced over his shoulder when they had rolled for a few minutes. Already Lilith was far away, her face peaceful. Noticing his movement, Redvers grunted. "Is cradle snatching a hobby of yours?" he said. "My latest craze. She tried to steal my star-dropper yesterday." "Addict, I guess." Dan knew he sounded puzzled. He was. "It's not like any addiction I ever saw before. I questioned her about her attitude, and I'm still working on the answers she gave." "Answers? Such as?" Dan summarized them. "What fogs me worst," he finished, "is her open-eyed, cold-blooded acceptance of the risk involved." "It could hardly be ignored," Redvers answered curtly. "Is something wrong?" Dan demanded. Redvers' voice had shaken on the last remark. He held the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white and sweat stood out on his forehead. "She said she'd keep the power down," Redvers grunted. "If she's not going to, she gets out of here." Dan listened. At the edge of hearing was a buzzing noise like a swarm of bees, but it seemed to come from ahead of them, not from behind. He said as much. "You're perfectly right," Redvers said with an effort. He halted the car for a stoplight. "I'm sorry, it's that car ahead of us. See it?" He pointed at a big sedan on the other side of the intersection with a loudspeaker showing through its open passenger window. "Wired to a star-dropper?" Dan said. "Exactly." Redvers craned to read the sedan's license plate. "Hasn't any business to do that. Illegal. Noise Abatement Act." He fumbled under the dashboard and produced a microphone and spoke briefly into it. The lights changed to green, and he let the car roll again. "Catch up with him in a few minutes," he said. "Can't help feeling sorry for him, though, can you?" He seemed to have recovered completely from his strange fit of shaking. "Why does he do it?" Dan asked. Most likely it almost means something to him. He's after someone to explain the rest of it. Quite common. Tell me, did Watson demonstrate his favorite setting to you? On a gale in Welchman? Yes, he did. Damnably attractive, isn't it? Any time you feel in danger of getting addicted yourself, I'll get one of our specialists to give you a post-hypnotic against listening to Star Droppers. I had to do that myself. That's why I was in such a state when the loudspeaker went by just now. So you have first-hand experience. I didn't realize. Redvers shrugged. I didn't ask to be put in charge of the Star Dropper problem. They picked me because I was involved. So it wasn't just my being an agency operative that made you take notice of me, Dan said. It was the Star Dropper. That's right. We like the agency fine. Star Droppers, on the other hand, give us nightmares. And can you wonder? Not after what I've already seen, but it surprises me that you already have a special department for the problem. What was the original reason? The wave of disappearances? No, not at first. The incidents of insanity, then the addiction problem. Speaking of disappearances, though, watch your step with Dr. Rainshaw. I meant to warn you. Why? His son Robin was one of the first to disappear. When they reached the research station where Rainshaw worked, Lilith was still motionless in the back seat. After pausing at the gatehouse for a security check, Redvers drove down the road signposted to the scientific block. You can leave the girl in the car quite safely, he said. She doesn't look as if she's going to wake up in a hurry, and the perimeter is well guarded. As he left the car, Dan gave her a worried look, but she was perfectly content. Surely star-dropping could not be wholly evil if it brought such an innocent expression to a girl's face. He shrugged and followed Redvers into the building. Rainshaw, he knew, had never claimed his discovery was more than an accident. He had been working on the relationship between gravity and magnetism, which accounted for his having assembled a powerful magnet, a vacuum chamber into which he was introducing counted quantities of ionized and non-ionized particles, and delicate instruments for tracking the latter whose signals required amplification before they were read. He also had the research scientist's prime gift, the ability to see things when they happened. Finding signals being generated in a way he could not explain, he followed them up. It was a matter of a few weeks to eliminate the inessentials and package the Rainshaw effect in a box. It was a matter of months before Berghaus formulated a theory which fitted the facts, but it seemed only a matter of days thereafter that the Rainshaw effect was forgotten and the Star Dropper was part of man's way of life. Dan's first impression was disappointing. He saw a hollow-cheeked man who looked as though he had worried himself into losing weight. He received them in an office adjoining a laboratory. Through the half-open door between the rooms, a man and a girl could be seen working on a breadboard device, and Rainshaw's eyes kept straying that way as though to show that he was enduring, not enjoying, the intrusion of visitors. For a while they conversed icily about Star Droppers. Dan felt he would have been better occupied talking to Watson at Cosmica, for he was getting nowhere. Luckily, when he was resigned to wasting his time, he happened to mention Berghaus. Rainshaw's frozen manner changed magically. "You know Berghaus?" he demanded. "You were a student of his?" "In a sense, I guess," Dan exaggerated. "He taught me what little I know about Star Droppers." "He taught all of us, including me, what we know about them," Rainshaw said warmly. "The man's purely a genius. Linking his theory of pre-recognition to my peculiar discovery was an inspired guess, and everything else we've turned up since then fits his guesswork. Well, well. So you know him. I apologize for my churlish manner up to now." He beamed. "How can I help you?" Sighing with relief, Dan said, "Quite honestly, Doctor, I want to know if you think the chance of gaining some useful knowledge from star dropping is enough to outweigh the suffering the habit can cause." Rainshaw twisted his hands together. He said, "I sometimes wonder if I ought to feel guilty. Well, it was an accident, and I've never claimed otherwise. But as to your question, Mr. Cross, all I can say is that my son—" He broke off. An extraordinary expression came to his face. Shock, plus dismay, plus a kind of weary sadness. Redvers drew in his breath, as though to imply to Dan, "I warned you." But after a moment, Rainshaw recovered himself and went on, seemingly unaware of the shock he had given his visitors. He said, "My son thought so, and I suppose in a way proved he was right." He leaned back in his chair, staring at nothing. "He was never a gullible person, you know. He was very reliable to work with, and we were working together on my effect right until he disappeared. And he did believe there was knowledge to be had from Stardropper signals." "What kind of knowledge?" Dan ventured after a pause. "I can only quote what he said on the last evening he was with me. He said, 'It's so hard to capture in words, so remote from experience. I get the feeling it may really come from an alien mind.' I think it was actually painful for him not to be able to make clear what he thought he had learned. He even began to doubt himself and went to his room to listen to the big star dropper he had built himself. When I went to call him to dinner, he wasn't there." His voice was empty of emotion, dry and hard. "You didn't hear anything?" Dan said. "No noise?" "No noise, Mr. Cross. I, too, have heard the stories about people who vanish in a clap of thunder, but Robin didn't. He simply went, and he didn't go any normal way out of the house. And he had nothing to run away from. He was working for his doctorate, doing research that fascinated him. He was engaged to marry a charming girl. I can only assume he did learn something from his star dropper, which enabled him to go elsewhere. I haven't any hope of following him. Young minds are flexible, and I'm getting old." Like all too obvious background music, a spray of rain rattled at the window and settled to a steady, depressing downpour. 6. As they walked towards the way out, Redvers said abruptly, "You were asking if I believed these disappearance stories." "I remember," Dan said. "I didn't know Rainshaw's view. I suppose now I have to." In the double-doored porch of the entrance, Dan hesitated, looking towards Redvers' car on the nearby parking area. The top had gone up, of course, at the first drops of rain, and Lilith was hidden from them. He said, gesturing, "Her, too, do you think?" Redvers made a vague gesture. "You heard what Rainshaw thinks. Young minds are flexible. She can't be more than about 16, 17, but young ones go insane, too. I can't grapple with it any longer, Cross. I just feel that the world is cracking apart and we're liable to drop into a bottomless fissure at any moment. We've felt that way for 30 years. This time it's different. You can point to the cracks and say they'll be so much wider tomorrow, and you look, and they are. It's one thing to be scared of a lunatic in a position of power or an incompetent government. That's human. I believe that's what saved us for so long, the fact that people are people. You've got something new here, alien knowledge, they tell us. It changes people, subtly. On the way down, you were saying how that girl disturbs you because she doesn't care about the risk of going insane. That's not ordinary human, Cross. Am I making sense or just rambling? I hadn't looked at it that way, but yes, you make sense. And we can't know what goes on in these changing minds, Redvers pursued. Not unless we get involved ourselves. I did. I found you have to choose. Quit cold and seek help, or decide that rewards you can't yet understand are worth more than staying ordinary. Let's go. I have work to do. The rain had lightened. Their feet made blurry mat marks on the pavement as they approached the car. Dan opened the passenger door and glanced into the back seat. His star-dropper lay neatly on the padded cushions, a slip of paper tucked between two turns of the strap. On the paper was penciled one word: "Thanks." But Lilith wasn't there. He looked at Redvers. Neither of them said a word. They drove to the gatehouse and spoke with the security officer in charge. She had not gone through the gate. She could not have crossed the perimeter fence. There was a procedure for checking whether she was in the grounds or the buildings. It was applied, but she was nowhere to be found. During the drive back into the center of London, Redvers said one thing which remained enduringly in Dan's mind. This is where it really starts, Cross. Not when a young genius like Robin Rainshaw goes out. When it happens to a school kid who most likely took to star-dropping because it was the thing everyone was doing. I expect it to rain for 40 days, and I don't know where the Ark is, or even if one is being built. It was the flood image, Dan thought, that fixed that in his mind. He had just been comparing himself to a man who sets out to cross an apparently level street awash with rainwater and finds himself up to his shoulders after 5 steps. His assignment had seemed petty enough: to go to Britain, talk with Stardropper fans, check rumors that more than one person has vanished, assess the social disruption it's causing, and if anyone is exploiting that disruption, say so. It's dangerous. It was clear to him now that the agency had fallen into a trap it had escaped in its 12 previous years of existence. It had assumed that a clearly visible threat was less menacing than a threat you had to hunt for. It was not surprising that Dan, as an individual, had mistaken star-dropping for just another craze. He was otherwise occupied. But the agency, with eyes and ears the world over, must have known about star-dropping. Yet they'd left it till now to start worrying. So they'd better start making up for lost time. The car halted outside his hotel. He made to get out and hesitated. He turned to Redvers. "Which scares you the most?" he demanded. "A rising wave of disappearances or the spread of insanity, or none of those?" Redvers cut in. "It's the fear that matters. The fear of someone else getting there first. I saw 2 Chinese in Cosmica Limited yesterday. I wondered about that. Their government discourages star-dropping and has a crash research program staffed by brilliant university students, and Rainshaw is working at a government research station here instead of his old university. Listen, Cross, I told you everyone else had got into the act before you, and I wasn't making with words. You imagine what will happen the day someone newsworthy vanishes in plain sight of reputable witnesses. Headlines: Miracle Talents from Star-Dropping. A few thousand people will kill themselves from disappointment. A few tens of thousands already interested will move over to the stage of real addiction. A few millions will go out and buy star-droppers, hoping for the same results. Is just disappearing such a tempting thing? Try looking at it less critically. Think of it as performing a miracle, and you'll see." Redvers beat on the steering wheel with his hands. "Because of Berghaus's theory, the reasoning will go: someone has alien talents I haven't got. Someone can use them against me. I've got to prevent him. It's what we thought was going to happen with the arms race. But you can spy on another country's scientific progress, keep a precarious balance. Here's a slew of wild factors coming in, and you can't spy on the mind of one man with one star dropper. Cross, your agency is bound not to do anything for any single nation or group, but to act when the world is in danger. I've been setting out facts for you. If they add up the same way for you as for me, you're going to put in an emergency report. There was urgent appeal in Redver's eyes. Dan nodded, his mouth dry, and got out of the car. He put in the call from his hotel suite. The connection was made very quickly. He heard the 3 shrill pips which were a key to his personal code and closed his eyes. 4, he said. Equanimity is inversely by the cluster. When it was in the trivial 4x4, the virtue was imparted, but the wall fell between the crackle and the Potiphar. It was a curious, uplifting sensation to hear himself speak this way. During his first 2 years at the agency, before he was operating on his own, he had been analyzed. From the complex personal associations revealed by analysis, they had built up a word-for-word code covering 100,000 words. New words and names could be spelt out with associated phrases for every letter. He learned the code next, having it pumped into him under hypnosis. The agency used hypnosis a good deal. Now, at the agency, there was a computer, number 4, into which they would feed the tape of his report, and it would print out in clear. It wasn't perfect, but because the equivalence depended on Dan's memories rather than on a process which could be attacked statistically, it would probably take as long to break as it had taken to build up. Even Dan had to have the post-hypnotic trigger before it was available to his mind. 4 pips on a lower tone followed his signing off, and he forgot again how to speak in the code. The sense of elation lingered, though. Sometimes it was very strong, like the aftermath of a vision, a feeling that he had been briefly in closer touch with reality. Ordinary language was a series of labels invented by others, but his code derived from events which had happened only to him. He dropped into a chair and took his star dropper on his lap. Lilith's scrap of paper was still caught in the strap. Had she slipped away like a mouse into a hole? Or had she gone as Robin Rainshaw went, miraculously? And did it matter? It seemed far worse not to be able to decide whether to pity her or to envy her. Which? 7. The Club Cosmica met in a big room over a smart modern bar. A curtain divided it into an antechamber with a bar and a meeting hall with rows of chairs and a dais. When Dan arrived, there were some 40 people standing around in little groups, talking. The sheer incongruity of it was disturbing. When else in all history had people joined chatty social clubs to meddle with something so dangerous? Maybe they had fireworks parties in ancient China and amused themselves with the newly discovered substance, gunpowder. Watson greeted him and took him to meet some of the members. As he was piloted from group to group, he caught snatches of conversation which seemed terrifyingly remote from reality. But the whole question of objective-subjective comes in here, so let's not get metaphysical. Objective, so far as we're concerned, means you can make it do things. Postulate a field such that, concede that his installation uses a lot of power, but anyone could hook a dropper on a 32,000-volt power line, and the signals would be heard from here to Yucatan. A waste of time, I think. Some of them serious young men illustrating their points with slipsticks, others struggling, their eyes haunted, to get across things there were no words to express. Nature of the signal in Berghaus's view. Identity of function isn't identity of nature. Department of truisms now open. This was a man of about 30 in an old suit, hair rumpled, eyes large and bright behind glasses. To say this is what the signals are like tells us nothing. On his left, a girl with fair hair, in expensive lounging slacks and a sleeveless tunic, gave a slow headshake. "You should try being more humble, Jerry. The first thing the signals say is what they are. You get an instinctive sense that you're eavesdropping on the minds of the universe at work." "If it says this to you, Angel, you're that much more susceptible. Your imagination was caught by Berghouse's idea, and bang, it was revealed truth." The girl called Angel raised one eyebrow. She was pretty, but her face was drawn and tired. "Jerry Berghouse Plus, I presume?" she said. "You know as well as I do, Berghouse came to the problem with an open mind." "And leaped a mile ahead of concrete evidence," Jerry snapped. "Because the signals are self-identifying," flared the girl. Watson excused himself in a whisper and went through the curtain to the other half of the hall. Dan went on listening. "Look," Jerry said, "he accounted neatly for precognition, true. When he came star-dropping, in my view, he stretched his precog theory to include it, simply because it was handy." A lean, 50-ish man on the other side of Angel took a pipe from his mouth and frowned. "But is Berghouse what you'd call an enthusiast?" he said. "I gather he's not." "He told me," Dan coughed, because instantly all the eyes of the group were on him. Well, it was a fast way to get into the conversation. "He told me he thought that if the signals are of alien origin, they're apt to be incomprehensible." "You know Berghouse?" Angel said in a wondering voice. "I've met him and talked about this with him." "And that louse Wally Watson didn't mention it to us?" "I don't think I told him," Dan said. He felt an impressed mood permeate the group. Jerry spoke in a changed voice. "Well, I'm Jeremy Bartlett, and this is Angel Allen. And Leon Patrick." The man with the pipe nodded. "And—" The other two in the group muttered names Dan barely heard. Angel kept her eyes on his face. "But he must take his theory seriously," she insisted. "He pins less faith to it than most people seem to." "So much for your self-identifying bit, Angel," Jerry said. She turned to him. "Not at all. Tell me how it feels to ride a bicycle." "Be reasonable. You sit astride. You put one foot—" "I didn't say explain the mechanics of it. I said tell me how it feels. You can't verbalize the balancing sensation, but you can learn it when it happens to you. Human beings can absorb nonverbal knowledge. We just aren't very good at it." "You're not going for this supernatural wisdom bit, are you?" Jerry's bluster was beginning to return. "Don't fall back on loaded words like supernatural. If you don't want to be convinced, why are you here?" "I'm a physicist. Star-dropper signals are a phenomenon in my province, and I don't claim to know more than Berghouse about his own speciality." Angel sighed. "Did I claim to know more than Berghouse? I say he proposed his theory because the signals convey a hint of their nature. If he has reservations, that's simply a scientific attitude." Watson's voice, raised loudly, called them to take their places for the demonstration. They joined a slow shuffling procession into the other half of the room. Dan hoped the argument would resume later. It was getting interesting. He took a place in the front row at Angel's invitation, between her and the pipe-smoking Leon Patrick. On the dais, a roly-poly man was making final adjustments to a huge star-dropper. Watson introduced him as their demonstrator, Jack Neal, and left him to it. Neal talked fast, with a lot of jargon, and Dan followed little of what he said. He let his mind drift down the line of the argument between Angel and Jerry. The girl's view that the signals were self-identifying was like a medieval schoolman's logic, satisfying, provided you could swallow the postulate behind it. She seemed convinced, but a long way from Lilith's terrible obsession state. Or was it merely that she was better equipped to put her feelings into words? Jerry, contrary-wise, was an utter skeptic. He had claimed he was investigating something in his own province of physics. Well, you could make out a good case that he was fooling himself. A star-dropper was outside orthodox physics. Maybe that was why he was so aggressive. Neil reached the end of his exposition. The lights went down, and a vast, busy noise suggesting a factory began to swell from the speaker. Dan went on frowning over his own thoughts. Clearly, not everyone accepted the notion that star-dropping was a key to mystic alien knowledge. Jerry had pooh-poohed it. And this man, Leon Patrick, seemed to incline to the same view. There was a tremendous racket coming from the speaker now. He recalled the snatch of conversation he had heard about an installation that used a lot of power. If there was a linear relationship between power and range in the case of a star-dropper, then the more power you used, the less likely you were to get signals from human sources which you might understand. He was beginning to feel foggy. It was frustrating, like having a word on the tip of his tongue, to contemplate the improbability of a linear power range ratio in a Berghausian continuum. Anyway, the fact that star-dropper signals were conveniently presented through a loudspeaker was accidental. Words and mathematical symbols and variables in a computer went through the same motions as their counterparts and were not the same. Human beings were used to learning through ears first, eyes next. With an effort, he seized control of his mind. He had had the utterly shocking impression that he was thinking in several directions at once, radiating outward from a center. For a few seconds he remembered where he was and what was going on. Then he was tugged back into his stream of speculation. Look, it couldn't be that a star-dropper consuming more power had a greater range. The whole point of Berghaus's new continuum was that the distance, in the sense of space covered in measured time, was theorized out of existence. But if you discarded distance, how could you have separation? Easily, of course. Weren't there events turned up by nuclear physicists which called for just that? Like an electron departing simultaneously in more than one direction from a given point, or coexisting with itself on two different paths. There was separation without conventional distance, because the one electron involved wasn't traversing and intervening space. Berghaus's main proposition was that in his continuum, instantaneity reacquired the meaning it had lost in an Einsteinian continuum where even light takes time to cover distance. He permitted precognition by invoking the phrase, "at the same time," which, in Einsteinian terms, was not allowed. But that meant... On the brink of fitting together his thoughts about the nature of things in this eerie alternative space postulated by Berghaus, he was slammed back to the here and now. Choking with rage, he opened his eyes. Fractionally later, the lights went up. He felt idiotically astonished to find he was sprawling sideways over the chair next to his own. The noise of the star-dropper ceased. There was a wave of frightened exclamations. "Leon!" someone said clearly. "Where's Leon?" Dan pushed himself upright and looked around. He saw everyone else he recalled seeing since he arrived, but not the lean, pipe-smoking man he had sat next to. He got to his feet. Neil and Watson were coming down from the dais. Everyone fell silent, as though looking to Watson for a lead. "Mr. Cross, you were thrown across Leon's chair, weren't you?" Watson said, puzzlingly. "Yes." Dan felt his palms sticky with sweat. "And there was a slamming sound, like a gigantic hand clap?" A dozen eager voices confirmed this. "Then," said Watson with apparently sincere regret, "I'm afraid we've seen the last of Leon Patrick." He hesitated while a wave of terror and dismay swept the audience, and finished, "Poor devil." 8. Dan remembered clearly when he had last seen so many ghastly white faces at once, at the scene of an expressway crash in which 4 children were killed. There was the same expression, too, the look of people reminded in a flash that they were engaged in a dangerous pursuit, then driving at 90 miles an hour, now star-dropping. There was a long silence. People began to turn away towards the door. Dan wanted to shout after them, ask questions, demand an inquiry. But to everyone else it seemed that Patrick's vanishing was simply an event to be accepted. The slamming noise implied that something had gone wrong. That was all. He saw the girl, Angel, staring at Leon's vacant chair, hugging her arms close to herself as though to control a fit of shivering. Neil, his face lugubrious, walked back to the dais to disconnect his machine. "I guess that's all for tonight," he threw over his shoulder. "No! Oh, no!" The cry was flung like a bomb. Everyone still in the room turned to face the speaker, a drab woman of young middle age. Her washy, carrot-red hair was the only touch of color about her. "No, that's not fair," she went on, her lips trembling. "I was getting something, I swear I was. And it's the first time I ever did, and I don't see why you should cheat me like this." "Ghoul," said Angel, barely above a whisper. "Who is she?" Dan asked, equally softly. "Her name's Mrs. Towler. I think she's crazy. Can you imagine anything more ghoulish than wanting to go on after—" She gestured at Leon's chair. "Shall we leave them to fight about it, or are you in the ghoul line too?" For a moment, Dan remembered that he too had been on the edge of some revelation, but the memory was fading like the transitory euphoria following the use of his personal code. He said, "I could do with a drink. Let's go down." The news was already causing a sensation in the bar below, but Dan and Angel managed to elude questioning by the other customers and sat down in silence at a corner table. After a long interval, Angel said, "It's different actually being there when it happens, isn't it?" Dan took out cigarettes and gave her one. He said, "Didn't you believe it?" "In my mind, I had to. After all, I was engaged to Robin Rainshaw, but I didn't believe it completely until now." "You were Robin Rainshaw's fiancé?" "I was. I suppose. Who can say? But you sound surprised. You didn't know Robin, did you?" He shook his head. "I only heard about him." "Not many people even heard." "What I want to know," Dan said after a pause, "is how it can all pass off so lightly, the disappearance of Patrick and of your fiancé. It's too much to take for granted." She gave him a curious look. "You're a real novice, aren't you?" she said. "In spite of knowing Berghaus and— How do people stop being novices if they don't ask and learn by asking? You don't learn this by asking. You learn by experience. But if you're apt to vanish in a clap of thunder, what can induce anyone to want more experience?" Before Angel could reply, the red-haired Mrs. Towler came marching through the bar to the street door, tears streaming down her face. A murmur of incredulous comment followed her. Directly behind her, Watson appeared. He stood watching till Mrs. Towler had gone out, then turned and caught sight of Dan and Angel. Unbidden, he sat down at their table. "I calmed her with the promise of a private session with Jack's equipment," he said. "It was all I could do." "She isn't going to make it, is she?" Angel said. "Her? No. Or if she does, she'll go out like Leon. Watson passed his hand over his face. Do you think I'll ever make it? Angel said, dispiritedly. You can't predict it, Angel. You just keep trying. It seems to me, Dan cut in, choosing the nastiest way to phrase the thought, people who want to go on with an example like Patrick before them are like drug addicts going on doping. Watson flushed. He said, I'm not in a mood to rise to cheap attempts at baiting. Star dropping isn't a drug, it's a path to new knowledge, as Berghaus suggested. Do you have this knowledge, or are you merely hopeful? Watson smiled sourly. You expect an answer to that? If I say yes, you'll say, explain it to me. And that's impossible. If I say no, you'll ask why I'm so sure it exists. Do you claim to know what happened to Leon Patrick? Yes, I do. Tell me, have you ever dropped an old-fashioned light bulb, the kind called vacuum-filled? I don't see the... Oh, the sound? That's right. Light bulbs? Angel said mockingly. What about them? If someone did physically vanish, there would be an implosion as displaced air rushed in. Dan felt his nape prickle. He turned to her. There was no noise when Robin disappeared, was there? Watson, what if Patrick had vanished silently? He would answer to hi, said Angel, and laughed. What? Carol, the hunting of the Snark. When the Snark proved to be a boojum, he softly and silently vanished away. She finished her drink and stood up. I'm sorry, I'm a bit hysterical. I'd better go home. Shall I run you back? Watson made to rise. You live near Cosmica, don't you? Thanks. I have my own car. You stay and answer our friend's questions. He needs his hand held. He's scared. With quick, uncertain steps, she went to the street door. As she passed, Jerry Bartlett called after her, but she ignored him. He looked round, caught sight of Watson, and came over. I didn't see you hidden in this corner, Wally, he said. I want to talk about Leon. He sat down and began to speak with machine-gun rapidity. I'm spinning so fast I'm dizzy. I was never there before when someone went out. I've been talking with Jack Neal and trying to work out the conditions for instantaneous displacement. I mean, it must be instantaneous. If a man-sized body were to leave at finite speed, the shockwave would bring the building down. If you spent more time with your star dropper and less time playing with words, Jerry, I think you'd make it, Watson said. Jerry didn't hear him. He went on. If Berghaus is right, the loudest signals on the dropper ought to be from the most highly evolved, most actively conscious races. What's human evolution? Basically a story of learning to impose a desired form on environment, which includes the series of events experienced. The more man evolves, the more he consciously plans ahead and manipulates randomness. But there's a gap here. He broke off, looking unhappy. Jerry, Watson said again, you need to spend more time with your dropper and less time talking. Acquiescent, Jerry wandered away, lost in thought. Dan stared at Watson. You're not just a store manager, are you? He said. To these people, you're more like a guru. Am I? Watson answered enigmatically. In a commercial society, what better niche for someone who's concerned to propagate knowledge he considers important? Dangerous knowledge, which seems more innocuous. To teach a man to read and write or to make gunpowder. Yet more revolutions have been carried through with literacy than with shot and shell. He stood up. Well, you've had a very eventful visit to our club, he said. Can I give you a lift home? I have the penthouse over Cosmica. Is that on your way? No, thank you. I'm going to walk so I can calm down. Dan licked his lips. Tell me, can't you think of a stronger term than eventful to describe what's happened tonight? Watson fixed him with his eyes. I'm not callous, Mr. Cross. Leon was a good man, and I liked him. I simply have to face the fact that he wasn't better. Good night. 9. Eyes stinging with lack of sleep, he walked across the hotel foyer to the breakfast lounge. He had had nightmares and preferred to eat in company rather than in his room. There was a knot of people arguing with the reception clerk. Some of them carried cameras. He had a premonition and quickened his steps. Pausing at the newspaper stand, he paid for a selection. As he did so, a voice rose authoritatively behind him. No, we don't allow anyone to intrude on our guests' privacy, press or no press. I thought so. It was clear what had happened. Grateful for the reception clerk's obstinacy, he went into the lounge and took an unoccupied table, shaking out the papers one by one. Garish headlines in blue and red leaped at him. Where did Patrick go? Stardropper fan vanishes. Remarkable event at Stardropper Club. There was a waiter bending over him. He said, Coffee. Black. A lot of it, and quickly. The manager sent me, sir, the waiter said under his breath. There are several reporters wanting to interview you. We don't want to let them guess who you are, but they're very insistent. Thank the manager for me, Dan said. They can go jump in the Serpentine before I'll talk to them. Very good, sir, the waiter said, and added, raising his voice, And the main dish? Smoked haddock, ham and eggs? Coffee. A lot of it. I'll decide about the rest later. Very good, sir. That was service, Dan reflected. He bent to the papers again. This looked like what Redvers had feared, the disappearance of someone newsworthy. For Patrick had been director of a large real estate agency, and his son was a champion cushion-craft jockey. He had a sickening sense of sliding helpless to disaster. The press had been thorough. Among others, they had found Watson, Jeremy Bartlett, and Angel Allen. The treatment varied from skeptical to sensational, but no one was making fun of it. Worse yet, someone digging in the morgue had uncovered the human interest angle of Angel's engagement. Clearly, Redvers, or someone else, had planted a story to cover Robin's disappearance, but here, under a red subhead, were the words, Was it coincidence that brilliant Robin Rainshaw, son of the inventor of the Stardropper, was doing such research when he vanished? That question must be asked now. Mr. Cross? A mild voice inquired. He looked up. Taking a place at his table was a nondescript man with a wisp of sandy beard. A reporter who had eluded the watchful staff? Memory clocked. No, this man had been among the 40 or so in the audience at the Cosmica Club. No good denying his identity then. He said, Who are you? Norman Ferrars, Mr. Cross. You were sitting next to Patrick at the club last night. I want to talk to you about that. I have nothing to say to you, Dan answered curtly. Not at all put out, Ferrars picked up one of Dan's papers. He opened it to the editorial page and offered it to Dan, marking the leading article with one finger. Perhaps you haven't read this yet. I think you should. After a second's hesitation, Dan looked at the paper. Not since the advent of atomic energy has there been a new power so pregnant with possibilities and so fraught with danger as the miraculous talent which, we must now believe, is hidden in the signals of stardroppers. Perilous, yet full of promise, it must be handled with care. It went on like that, empty pontificating. Dan put the paper aside. A lot of hot air, he snapped at Ferrars. Think again, Mr. Cross. I know that over the past decade, Our government has caused a divergence between your country and mine, but there's a real identity of interest, and some of us work to preserve and maintain it against treachery. I put it to you. Suppose that the Eastern Bloc manages to control this. Who are you? Dan said, sudden chill in his voice. I'm a member of the Blue Front, Mr. Cross. Our organization is conducting an emergency inquiry into the Patrick case. I put it to you as an American that it's your duty to help us. Wouldn't you rather that this power was first gained by people whose traditional links with your own countries? It took Dan that long to marshal his words. He drew a deep breath. If there was one thing he had learned working for the special agency, it was that a nationalist in the nuclear age was as anachronistic as a crusader yelling, "Death to the infidel!" And the Blue Front was one of the most reactionary groups in Europe. The agency had often tangled with them. He said, "Listen to me. This is the nuclear age. This is the world of rockets and satellites, and our planet has shrunk so small we have no room to think with our muscles anymore. My community of interest is with the human race at large. I'm a human being first and an American second. Go away." The waiter arrived with his coffee. Dan pointed a rolled newspaper at Ferrars and said, "Get this person out of here." The waiter set the coffee pot down and turned to Ferrars. "You're not a client of the hotel, sir," he said. "This gentleman is, and wishes to be undisturbed. Please leave." Ferrars stood up, his face suddenly ugly. "I don't know if you're a conscious traitor or a fool," he said, "but we shall be watching you. The country is crawling with Reds, and they are bound to try and pump you. They'll get the same answer, if that'll ease your small mind," Dan answered grimly. "Are you going?" Ferrars bared his teeth and spun on his heel. "Nasty piece of work, sir," the waiter said. "We apologize for not keeping him away from you, but it's very difficult." "You've done well so far," Dan said. "Thank you. There's a call for you from a Mr. Redvers, by the way. Shall I bring the phone?" Dan sighed. "Okay, I'd better talk to him." "Morning, Cross. What do you make of it?" "You're slow. I already had a member of the Blue Front here. Investigating the Patrick case was the excuse he gave." "I hope you spat in his eye. Listen, Cross, you were sitting next to Patrick, weren't you? You didn't get an inkling that something was going to happen or notice anything special?" "No, not before it happened. I was preoccupied. Afterwards, I was too shocked to think straight. I didn't sleep worth mentioning last night, and when I did, I had nightmares." "So did I. You realize this is probably the one we've been waiting for, which will really scare people?" "You don't think there's any way of counteracting that?" Redvers gave a mirthless laugh. "Not that I know of. It's up to you, isn't it?" He broke the connection. Dan signaled the waiter to take the phone away. It was odd the way Redvers seemed to be looking to him, not to the agency, which would be logical enough, but to Dan personally. He ate his neglected food absently. His mind was running on the same track it had followed during his wakeful night. Time and again he fetched up against the same conclusion. He had facts, but no sense, evidence, but no information. He recalled what he had said to Watson, that he was not just the store manager he pretended to be. Logically, then, he must go back to Watson. 10. Redvers' gloomy prophecy was being fulfilled to the letter. Cosmica Limited was full of people, and 2 policemen were trying to control the jostling crowd on the sidewalk outside. As Dan approached, he saw a middle-aged man emerge from the store with a new star-dropper. At once, a dozen eager would-be customers converged on him, offering to buy it from him. You couldn't yet say it was at the stage of hysteria, but already there was a fearful greed in the eyes of successful purchasers which made Dan's nape prickle. He had learned to exploit his height as part of his agency training. He bore himself commandingly into the crowd, and without knowing why they did so, people made way for him, so that he entered the store ahead of 20 earlier arrivals. Inside the store, he had another advantage. He wasn't interested in the star droppers which were on display. He worked himself to within 2 or 3 places of the counter. The staff were getting harassed and irritable. Dan caught the eye of the pretty girl who had served him before, and she grimaced, pushing her hair back from her face. Directly in front of Dan were 2 men in business suits, one carrying what Dan took at first glance for a star dropper, but which proved to be a camera. As became clear immediately, the girl came to serve them. The pair were hopeful journalists. He didn't catch what the man without a camera said, but he got the girl's answer because it was shrill with impatience. "No, Mr. Watson isn't available, and I don't know where he is." The reporter persisted. The cameraman nudged him. "Jack, why don't you just put it down that he vanished up his star dropper too?" he suggested cynically. Jack scowled at him. The girl made to attend to another clamoring customer, but he caught her arm. Miss, I think I'll take the chance while I'm here and buy one of your droppers." The girl slammed a catalog in front of him and said in a hard voice, 5 through 9 and 29 and 42 are out of stock. I'll be back when you make up your mind." "Jack, you're not falling for this, too?" the cameraman said. "I don't know," Jack said slowly. "I just don't know." It was nearly 10 minutes before Dan could get out of the store again. The crush was worse than ever. Seeing he had bought nothing, a sly-faced man sidled up to him. "Say, I have good bargains in star droppers if you want one. Good, scarcely used second-hand instruments of highest quality. Prices ridiculously low, you understand?" He winked. "Handmade American star droppers for £50 cash. Regular British instruments for 25 and up." Dan ignored him. He was probably offering stolen goods, and that gave him an idea. The sly man saw his sales talk was not taking effect and turned his attention elsewhere. Dan walked briskly along the street, studying the buildings. Watson had mentioned that he had the penthouse on top of the building where Cosmica was located. This whole area had recently been rebuilt, and to eliminate traffic congestion caused by trucks unloading most of these blocks, had access tunnels running under them parallel with the street. Correct. He had gone barely a quarter mile before he came to a sloping service ramp. Without hesitation, he marched down it. There was no difficulty in finding Cosmica's delivery entrance either. A huge truck lettered with the name Gale and Welchman, Birmingham, was being unloaded. Several eager star droppers were clustered around trying to bribe the truckers to let them have instruments straight from the packing cases. A harassed apprentice was trying to carry a big box through the back door of the store. Dan held the door for him, and he did not question Dan's right to follow him through. Once in the building, Dan found himself in a corridor running behind the sales room. An elevator car stood vacant with the door open. He strode into it and punched the penthouse setting. It had been almost too easy. Surely a persistent reporter could have located Watson's address from a directory and come this way to see if he were at home. Well, perhaps some reporters had done so and been disappointed. Dan didn't care whether he was at home or not. He stepped out in a short corridor at the top. At either end, a frosted glass window let in daylight. A sign beside each window stated that there was an outside fire escape. There was a narrow stairway for use if the elevator failed, but the treads were dusty. Opposite the elevator was a door on which a printed card was fixed. The card read, Walter K. Watson. As a precaution, he thumbed the buzzer. There was no reply. He inspected the doorframe. Tiny metal tabs indicated a Laxton and Carpenter alarm system. He could get past that with only a little trouble. When he had located the leads and shortened them out, he attacked the lock. It yielded to a minute's use of his pocket knife. It was a perfectly good knife, but it was also a special agency operative's standard toolkit. If you didn't know how to open it, an oxyacetylene torch or an X-ray photograph at high intensity was needed to reveal its secrets. He left the door open long enough to walk around the small but luxurious apartment. All clear. He closed the door, opened one of the bedroom windows, from which it was possible to reach the outside fire escape, in case he was interrupted, and settled to work. Unhurriedly, he went through the lounge first, then the bedroom. He found nothing peculiar before he came to the tall, built-in closets in the bedroom. There were correspondence files, books and notebooks, and many personal papers, but none referred to star-dropping except incidentally, as one would expect from Watson's job. Yet he could not be a mere store manager. What the heck was he doing with a diving suit hung up in his wardrobe? Dan stared. Yes, a diving suit. One of Zeba and Gorman's ultra-lightweight outfits, made of scarlet imperviflex for easy seeing underwater. It looked almost new. With it were the goldfish bowl helmet, lighter than a metal one, and a sealed camera and a set of oxygen tanks. The meters showed full. Who in the world made a hobby out of suit diving? He looked again and realized suddenly, no boots. For suit diving you had to have weighted boots, and there were none here. He hunted further and did not find them. He found a file of typed notes in a drawer of shirts. They were headed CPF and bore a date 2 months previous. They consisted mainly of lists of numbers with such comments as unconfirmed and definite. They told him nothing. He went on. The next thing he found was a box of color slides, which might have been taken with the sealed camera in the closet with the diving suit. The slides showed thick dark greenery and red-yellow desert with eroded rock formations. He guessed at Australia or South America, but he could not say for sure. He looked at 20 and put them back. There were hundreds altogether. In the last closet he opened, there was a sack of rocks. He was no geologist, and they, too, told him nothing. Replacing everything as it had been, he went back to the file of notes. This time he turned up a handwritten sheet he had overlooked and found what the letters CPF stood for. The writer, presumably Watson, had put, "It's the cocktail party factor. No simple solution." That was clear, at least. It was the standard nickname for sorting a sequence of information out of a jumble of background noise. But he already knew that Watson did serious research into Stardropper signals. He put the notes back in their place. There was no sign of a Stardropper in the apartment, but if the firm downstairs carried 60 different models, Watson could presumably pick and choose from those. Not significant. He left the bedroom and moved to the kitchen. Again, nothing in the least peculiar. A bright red man shape moved across the open kitchen doorway. Dan froze, and had not had time to decide on a course of action when a pleasant, rather tired voice said, "Wally? Is that you?" And the intruder looked into the kitchen. He was young, perhaps 25, and he was wearing a diving suit like the one in Watson's closet. He had taken off his helmet and clasped it under his arm. "I thought you were Wally," he said. "Where is he?" Dan's mind spun like a super-efficient machine. "Someone went out at the club last night. There's been a big scandal. He's keeping out of the way of the press." The stranger nodded and laid his helmet down. "Give me a hand with these bottles, will you?" he said, unfastening the harness which held his oxygen cylinders. Warily, Dan came out of the kitchen and helped him to wriggle free. "That's better," the stranger said. "A bit wearing, not being able to crack the suit for 24 hours on end. How bad is this scandal, as you call it?" "It's going to be an international incident, I imagine. Everyone and his uncle is out buying star droppers." The stranger peeled off his suit. "I suppose we couldn't avoid it much longer. By the way, I don't think we've met." Dan gave his name, tensing, but the stranger nodded. "A member of the club?" he suggested. "Since just lately." "Aha! I've been away at 61 so much it's not surprising that I don't know you. I'm Robin Rainshaw." 11. Dan's self-control held good. He did not betray his shock by movement of a single muscle. He only paused for a few seconds before he could trust his voice to remain steady. Robin Rainshaw did not notice. He was clearly at home here. He dropped his suit on a chair, walked to the bathroom, and began to fill the tub. While the water was running, he got himself a plate of salad from the refrigerator. It was clear why he had accepted Dan's presence so calmly. He must know about the alarm on the door, and since it took a specialist with agency training or a skilled burglar to get past it, he would assume that Watson had let Dan in or given him a key, or that Dan had come by the route he himself had taken. Either way, Dan must be party to the stunning secret that the powers gained from the Star Dropper had been understood and put to use. Dan studied him, thinking he was rather ordinary-looking, fair-haired, fresh-faced, quick to smile. He did not look like a man who could walk into a locked apartment without using the door. Rainshaw came back with his food and sat down to attack it. Weighing his words, Dan said, "I met your father the other day." Rainshaw nodded. "How is he?" "He looks very worried. He's losing weight." "The strain must be awful." Rainshaw frowned. "I almost wish I'd been hard-hearted enough not to tell him that I'd gone out. But it would be worse if he thought I were dead." So Dr. Rainshaw was keeping up a pose. He must be doing it well, or Redvers's attitude to him would have been different. "Where did you say you'd been?" he ventured. 61, again. 61 Cygni." This time the shock was still worse. 61 Cygni? That was a star, and one that had become famous because there astronomers had located an extrasolar planetary system. Oh, it hung together. The diving suit against an alien atmosphere or alien bacteria, color slides which Dan didn't recognize as showing any place on Earth, and this man could come home as calmly as from a walk around that block. That was shocking. But here, illegally in a stranger's home, was no place to figure it all out. He would have to probe for information, and it would be doubly difficult because he didn't know how someone in his position ought to react. How was the trip? Innocent enough, that, surely. As usual, not very rewarding. The Earth-type planet of the system matches our gravity very closely, so it's a convenient trip, but our friends who originated the dropper signals must be closer to the center of the galaxy. Probably no one except ourselves in this area has got so far. Half-remembered information prompted Dan's next question. "We're sort of prematurely arrived on the scene?" he suggested. "I'm sure of it. It would probably have taken another 1,000,000 years of evolution if we hadn't chanced to cross the Star Dropper. Still, that's our particular gift, gadgetry." There's definitely no one at home at 61? Oh, no. The level of evolution suggests Earth as it was 500,000 years ago. Rainshaw put his plate aside. Nothing to eat, either. We're allergic to a basic protein complex of the local life forms. Got a cigarette? Dan gave him one. You're American, Rainshaw went on. How are things your side? Dan thought wildly of the news that was blazoned across the papers, but he said, quiet compared with here. I got into this through meeting Berghaus. That name might improve his precarious standing with Rainshaw. But I'm a real novice to the whole thing. I told you Wally is dodging the press after what happened at the club. I'm doing the same because I was next to the guy who went out. A good one or a bad one? Who was it? A bad one, I'm afraid. A man called Leon Patrick. Rainshaw got up to turn off his tub, but came back to sit and finish his cigarette. Don't know him, he said. And you were next to him? Not comfortable, I imagine. Very uncomfortable. And Jack Neal was running a very interesting demonstration. He broke off. Rainshaw's face hardened with intense suspicion, and so did his voice. Who are you? Rainshaw said. What are you doing here? Stunned, Dan tried to decide what had given him away. He was still tongue-tied when Rainshaw disappeared. Dan swung around. There he was at the door, inspecting the lock and the alarm. At least he would find no sign of tampering, but here he was, back in a flash, not reassured, confronting Dan from just beyond arm's reach. Well? He said, harshly. Well, what? Dan said. He was terrified and not ashamed of the fact. How could anyone help it, suddenly faced with a man who could go instantly from place to place? He saw puzzlement breach Rainshaw's suspicion. A stranger and outsider ought to have been taken aback by a display of teleportation, but Dan's acting was proof against that. Seizing his chance, Dan said, What's wrong? I was going to say that a Mrs. Towler got hysterical at the demonstration being called off. Why? She thought, watch it. She was going to go out too. The suspicion was fading still more. Dan put on an injured expression. Who did you think I was? He demanded. You just saw for yourself that the door's fast. Calm down. I'm sorry, Rainshaw said. It was what you said about Neil's demonstration that worried me for a moment. Calling it interesting, you mean? Yes. Rainshaw sat down slowly, his hostility fading but latent. There can't have been more to it than there ever is to a club demonstration, least of all at Club Cosmica. Only the signals matter. Dan took another gamble. He said, Well, the Mrs. Towlers of the world aren't to know that, are they? His head was threatening to spin with the illusion that he was playing some childish game of forfeits instead of fencing in a deadly duel of words. However, his improvisations had saved him this time. He began to relax. Too soon, but there was nothing on earth he could do. For there was Watson, standing behind Rainshaw's chair, more suddenly than a conjuring trick. He was trapped. You couldn't run away from a man who could put himself instantly between you and your way of escape, but he desperately wanted to try. How did you get in here, Cross? Watson said, his narrowed eyes menacing. Rainshaw stood up. He's not a friend of yours? Not one of us? No, Watson said shortly. He turned up 2 or 3 days ago, posing as a novice Stardropper fan. But there must be more to him than that. Well, Cross? Rainshaw looked crestfallen. He said, "I talked too freely, Wally. When I found him here, I naturally assumed can't be helped." Watson brushed the apology aside. The phone began to ring. He shot a glance at it, and Dan saw the attention switch move twice, making and breaking the connection. He can move things at a distance, too. "Cross," Watson snapped. "I want to know who you are, whether you're dangerous or just nosy, and quickly. I could pick you up without touching you and hang you over the street, and since you're heavy, I'd get tired, and pretty soon I'd have to let you drop. Want me to prove it?" Rainshaw made to object. Watson glared at him. "All right," he said to Dan. "I'll prove it to you." There was a snatching sensation, not like something taking hold of him, but as though all his body were being moved, like the express elevator feeling turned sideways. By reflex, Dan resisted, and for a moment he was seeing blackness. Blackness? Not just the lack of sight caused by blinking, though it lasted no longer, but dazzling blackness. His eyes stung. His skin felt as though it had been pounded with leather straps. There was straining tension in his ears, and he had to exhale as though he had been punched in the belly. His sinuses hurt like blazes. But against the blackness, sharply thrown into relief like an overexposed photograph, he had seen the shape of a man. And all this happened so quickly he had no time to be puzzled before he found he was not facing Watson and Rainshaw. He was behind them on the other side of the room, and they were just turning with expressions of blank amazement. "But he can," Rainshaw said, and then, seeing Dan, swung towards him and changed the words. "But you can." 12. The phone bell stabbed the air again. Watson stopped it automatically. He said, "I think," and broke off, putting his hands to his forehead. Rainshaw said, "I'll swear that was the first time, and no one has ever gone out for the first time, not actually listening to a dropper. I think this man is an exception to everything," Watson said. "Cross, who are you?" Dan wiped tears from his tortured eyes. He did not know how he had gone to the other side of the room, or the meaning of the vision of darkness which seemed to punctuate the journey. All that mattered now was that Rainshaw and Watson might explain. He said wearily, "I'm an operative of the UN Special Agency." Rainshaw gave a humorless chuckle. "I guess we're lucky at that," he said. Watson took no notice. "Are you really a Stardropper fan?" he demanded. "I was given a Stardropper by my chief last Friday. I never more than dabbled before then." "Then you've set an incredible record for speed of assimilation." Watson was recovering his poise. "A predisposition, maybe, Robin?" Rainshaw bit his lip. Now the first panic reaction was over. Dan felt he was being regarded as a scientific curiosity. He burst out, "Will you tell me what this is all about?" Watson hesitated. "What happened when you went from here to there?" he said. Dan told him. "No one could have dreamed that up without seeing it." Watson nodded. "Fantastic chance that you saw one of the failures." "Failures?" "Yes. Perhaps even Leon Patrick, poor devil. But no, the point must have shifted. More likely someone we don't know about. They're coming thick and fast now. The news of Patrick's going out ripped a lot of people past the point of incredulity and let them cut loose." He gestured at Rainshaw. "Set him straight, will you?" Rainshaw sat down by feel in a nearby chair. Conscious of near exhaustion, Dan copied him. "Just now you went out," Rainshaw said. "You found yourself at a point between here and the sun, where the gravitational potential matches that here in this room. By luck or quick thinking, you came back before much harm was done. But I see your eyes are watering, and you came back gasping like a stranded fish. You'd better get a dose of a good anti-radiation drug. But you're better off than you'd have been in a spaceship, because the primary cosmics went through you as though you weren't there. And in a ship, you stop a lot of slow secondaries. I'm rambling. Dan sat numbly, waiting for sense to emerge. The bad cases, as we call them, don't come back. A person goes out to that point of equivalence because it's easier to aim for than a place on Earth's surface, and it's also a spectacular trip. Accurate aiming takes practice. Out there, it follows from the least resistance principle. A bad case panics and dies, and there's no helping him. A good case, like you, comes back and by reflex balances the energy account involved. Think, and you'll see that someone who goes out quietly changes places with an equal volume of air. You did that, over-elaborating because you took a long way round, but there was scarcely a whisper of sound. You're good, or you're going to be. But I don't know how I did it, Dan protested. I think I have it, Watson said. If there's one thing everyone knows about the special agency, from TV and movies, it's that the operatives each have a personal association code. True, Dan confirmed. And it's hypnotically locked away from consciousness, except when it's triggered. But I don't see... A code like that would get round the big obstacle most people meet, trying to understand dropper signals. Human knowledge is transmitted in words, arbitrary labels not chosen by the user, but a personal association code corresponds closely to real experience. So do star dropper signals. Then why... Dan thought of Lilith. Lucky kid to go out quietly. Why can a kid succeed and an adult fail? Fewer preconceptions, which helps, Watson replied. But also the experience they correspond to is, in everyday terms, impossible. And one man plus one star dropper is like a fisherman trying to catch one fish out of thousands, all hungry. The cocktail party factor, Dan said. Exactly. If you lose the right thread of information out of lack of concentration, you wind up insane or dead. And otherwise, you may be tantalized forever by a hint of meaning you can never properly grasp. Or you may keep hold of one strong, clear sequence of signals long enough to acquire the vicarious experience, which shows you how to carry out corresponding action. Dan remembered Angel's phrase about riding a bicycle. If she had got that close, she was probably going to make it. He wondered if she knew what had become of Robin. The clearest signals come from the most highly evolved minds, Watson was saying. Remember Jerry Bartlett saying that evolution consists in improving control over the environment. The commonest first talent learned from a dropper is teleportation, and telekinesis associated with it. For control of environment is also control of probability. I can't put it more exactly into words for you. It doesn't belong in words. There's a vanishingly small statistical possibility that a particle might be elsewhere than it's observed to be. Up till now, this could only be shown on a microcosmic scale. You must accept that control of one's location by act of will is part of the sequence which began with the very first plans for the future, planting seeds in spring for harvest in autumn. Not being able to verbalize it doesn't matter. We used fire for untold generations before we formulated a theory of combustion, and the early theories were wrong anyway. But it takes energy to go from place to place, Dan said. And to go to a star. Rainshaw cleared his throat. I let that slip, he said. Watson nodded. I'll show you where you're wrong, he told Dan. Imagine an airless planet as smooth as a billiard ball. Imagine an object in orbit a millimeter above its surface. Is there any reason why it should not continue forever without expending energy? I mean, in ideal space. At 1 millimeter. But, yes, all right, Dan frowned. At point A on the orbit, it has the same potential energy as at point B, but it's in a different place and has spent no energy. The return of a body to a former state of potential energy balances the energy accounts just as well as its remaining in that state. You yourself went to the equipotential point between here and the sun and returned and expended the following energy. That consumed in making an act of will, and that consumed owing to the difference of mass between your body and the air with which you changed places. So long as there's inertia, you can't avoid that. But by the look of you, you move 170 pounds at every step, so you didn't give that a second thought. There are points on planets throughout the universe to which we can go, after practice and experiment, as easily as stepping across a room. An animal doesn't know how it metabolizes its food, but it can run regardless. We'll figure out the mechanics later. Meantime, we're well occupied doing it. Most of it can be predicted from the Berghausian continuum, Rainshaw said. Actual instantaneity, previous action, separation without distance. I was getting that, Dan said, thunderstruck, at Neil's demonstration. I almost had it when Patrick went out. I thought so, Watson said. Probably the whole of your subconscious memory, which is full of your association code, has been finishing the job for you. Creative thinkers of all kinds often rely on that. It's simply what they call sleeping on an idea. Could you go out now, do you think? I'm not sure. There was a grinding, earthquake-like sensation in Dan's mind. You could walk to the stars. There really were alien intelligences. There really were natural talents. A few minutes ago he had feared and hated these men. Now his fear seemed petty. Odd, the phone hadn't rung again. Why should that cross his mind when he had 50 other questions burning his tongue? He said, And you? I know you have the talent. Why are you a store manager and not— I told you, Watson cut in. You didn't believe it. Through Club Cosmica and its 16 branches, and the store itself, which has an international reputation, I'm in touch with everyone doing serious research into star dropping. I see. And your demonstrations and so on are just a way of exposing people to specially informative signals, I suppose? Not exactly. They're a way of studying, not the signals, but the audiences. The buzzer on the door sounded. Rainshaw vanished, and Dan felt his stomach turn over. It would take a long time to adjust to such casualness. Watson got to his feet. That's probably a policeman, I know, he said. Since you're with the special agency, maybe you know him too. Redverse, Dan said. That's right. Watson was walking to the door. I would have mentioned, except that I haven't had time, that I went out this morning for a purpose. We've had to be crude, and I wish we hadn't, but I think we've made out. He was talking to himself rather than Dan. He opened the door. Standing back, he said, Hello, Hugo. Come on in. 13. Two unrelated thoughts occurred to Dan as Redvers came in. First, he called him Hugo. He must know him well. Second, One thinks of the crucial decisions being made in palaces and council chambers. Not here. Redvers strode in, hurtled the portfolio he carried into a chair, and looked at Watson with burning eyes. "I suppose you're pleased with yourself," he said in a dead voice. "How did you get him on your side?" He indicated Dan. "I didn't," Watson said. "He went out. He did it himself." Redvers sat down. "Why am I asking?" he said. "When we have so little time left, 72 hours, maybe." And then his false apathy broke apart. "Do you know what you've done?" he almost screamed. "Cross, do you know what he's been doing all this morning? Amusing himself at the expense of our lives, vanishing and reappearing under people's eyes. Fleet Street, Piccadilly, Lime Grove television studios, the Bull Ring in Birmingham, and Fifth Avenue and Red Square and the Boulevard Mao Zedong in Peking and other places," Watson said calmly. "Not by myself, of course. If I tried to go direct from here to the street, I'd be as smashed up as if I'd jumped. There were over 50 of us working together." His face crumbling with dismay, Redvers said, "You're out of your mind. That's all. I suppose now you've got your godlike powers you think you can stir us mortals up like a man kicking an ant-heap. Cross!" He shifted his gaze. "What do you think the results are going to be?" Dan stood up, almost too appalled to speak. He said, "But it is lunacy. It'll drive people crazy with fear. It makes a mockery of frontiers, of secrecy, security, even privacy. I wouldn't say 72 hours, more like 12. He looked accusingly at Watson. "You're stampeding the world into war." Watson took a cigarette from a box on a table. He didn't light it. He said, "That's the general idea, of course." Dan's mouth went dry. "At this moment," he said, "there's nuclear potential equivalent to 160 tons of TNT for everyone on Earth," Watson said, bored. "It was 80 tons a decade ago when we quit contributing to it in this country. I worked for us to quit. There are enough bacterial toxins to kill us all, too, and chemical weapons to do the job again. I read the papers." "Cross," Redvers said. "Is there any way to stop what this maniac has started?" Feeling sick and empty, Dan shook his head. Watson toyed with his unlit cigarette. He said, "You didn't get what you thought you did out of the dropper, did you, Hugo?" Redvers crushed his hands against his temples, as though to hurt himself into believing this was actually happening. "What's that?" Dan said. "I've been a fool," Redvers said, choking. "You were all I ever got out of a star-dropper, Cross. I wasn't so clever I could be waiting for a special agency man the moment he came off the plane. I knew beforehand out of the star-dropper I had. I learned that a big cross man was going to come from the West with the answer to the problem. When we saw your name on the passenger list, we checked up on who you were." He beat his fist into his palm. "I thought the special agency might save us. Only this crazy idiot has done what he set out to do, and the world is going to be smashed to bits." Dan thought of hardened missile sites, of submarines on patrol, of spy satellites and orbital hardware, 160 tons TNT equivalent for everyone alive. He looked at Watson. An itch of doubt remained in his mind. A maniac might be calm, but could he be so sardonically amused? Yet, if Redvers had told the truth... Watson, turning his cigarette in his fingers, said, "If you hadn't lost heart and given up star-dropping, Hugo, you might not be so miserable now.
I, too, figured out that this man Cross might have the answer. Admitted, I didn't see what the answer was till he went out, spectacularly, a few minutes ago. Have you worked it out yet, Cross, or are you still stuck with poor Hugo in a morass of despair?"
A spark of wordless hope flickered up in Dan's mind.
"Look!"
Watson commanded and held up the cigarette. It disappeared.
"There are a practical infinity of points in the universe," Watson said didactically, "where the gravitational potential is equal to that here. There is positively nothing easier than to scatter an object's constituent particles randomly among those points."
"Even a massive object?" Dan said.
"Exactly."
Watson smiled. No, this wasn't a maniac. This was a man with so much common sense, you automatically didn't believe it. Dan smiled back. He couldn't help it. "What are you grinning for?" Redvers said hysterically. "You saw that cigarette vanish," Dan said. "Spell it out."
"One moment," Watson said. "I've been assuming that if anybody knows where it all is, the special agency does, right?"
"I can tell you, myself, where every hardened missile site, every major stockpile of bacterial and chemical weapons, and most troop concentrations are located. The special agency has more such information than any national organization. It has to."
"The submarines are the problem,"
Watson suggested. "Yes, they'll have to be located individually." Dan's mind was racing. "It can be done, but it'll be difficult."
"What do you expect?" Watson said with sudden vehemence. "We've been at this business for a generation or so. Plenty of time to make it impossible to save the world."
"How many are there of us?" Dan said.
300 at least. More coming in all the time."
Watson chuckled.
"Our best recruits are from the government-sponsored Star Dropper projects of both East and West. It's the first thing you get out of a dropper, even before concrete information. The realization that in a universe full of who knows how many intelligent races, this is one small pebble, too small to contain narrow local loyalties."
Dan gave a sudden burst of laughter. He said, "I wonder how they're going to react." Already he was thinking in terms of they and we. And yet, not already, but always. That was why men set up organizations like the Special Agency to combat the mysterious they, always someone else, somewhere else, who did cruel, stupid things. Watson turned to Redvers.
"Are you with us yet?"
he said. Face buried in his hands, Redvers shook his head.
"Oh, said Watson. "Hugo, this was the first useful purpose we thought of to apply our new talents to. I'm already certain there isn't going to be a nuclear war, because ever since Patrick's disappearance made it certain there would be a crisis, we've been working that trick I showed you with my cigarette. Only we've been working it on plutonium cores in H-bombs, and botulinous toxin, and military bacteria, and small objects like the remote-controlled switches which actuate the firing circuits in missiles. 300 people with skill. This skill can do a great deal in a short time."
He turned to Dan and beckoned.
"Come on," he said. "We shall have to hurry."
The second time, Dan found, it was incredibly easy, and eventually, of course, there would be the stars. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.